It was the quietest hour of night when the knocking began, sharp, desperate, and completely out of place at the wrought iron gates of Francis Sullivan's Boston estate. The most feared crime boss in New England was reviewing shipment ledgers in his study when the sound echoed through marble halls that had never known a visitor without appointment. His security chief, Davis, entered the study with unusual hesitation. "Sir, there's a little girl at the gate, alone, soaking wet and asking for help." Something flashed across Sullivan's typically stoic face, perhaps confusion, perhaps the faintest hint of concern that would have shocked his enemies. The security monitors showed a child no older than 6 standing in the pouring rain, clutching a tattered teddy bear to her chest. Her blonde hair was plastered against her pale face, her dress muddied and torn at the hem. Sullivan gestured silently, and Davis opened the gates through the remote system. When the heavy mahogany doors swung open, the girl looked impossibly small against the mansion's towering entrance. She shivered violently, rainwater pooling around her bare feet on imported Italian marble. Her eyes, blue as winter ice, held none of the fear that Sullivan was accustomed to seeing when people faced him. "Please, sir," she whispered through chattering teeth. "They shot my mom. She told me to find you." Her voice trembled but remained strangely steady, as if delivering a message she'd been made to memorize. "She's by the old factory, and she's bleeding really bad." Sullivan's men exchanged uneasy glances, hands instinctively moving toward concealed weapons. This wasn't the usual midnight crisis they handled, not a territory dispute or a shipment gone wrong. It was a child with rainwater and what looked suspiciously like blood on her little dress. "What's your name?" Sullivan asked, his voice uncharacteristically quiet, as he crouched to the girl's eye level, something his associates had never witnessed before. His usual commanding presence softened just enough that the child didn't flinch away. "Grace," she whispered, clutching her teddy bear tighter. "My mom said you'd help us because you made a promise a long time ago." The words landed like physical blows, and for a moment, the unflappable crime lord seemed genuinely startled. Sullivan stood slowly, straightening his tailored suit jacket with practiced precision. "Who is your mother, Grace?" he asked, though something in his eyes suggested he already suspected the answer. A ghost from his past, he thought long buried. "Harriet Wheeler," the girl said, and the name hung in the air like gun smoke. Several of Sullivan's oldest guards exchanged meaningful glances, recognizing a name not spoken in their boss's presence for nearly 7 years. "Get the car," Sullivan ordered, his voice returning to its familiar steely command. "Now!" He grabbed his coat from the ornate rack by the door, slipping a handgun into his pocket with practiced ease. "And call Dr. Fletcher." Sullivan led the child toward his armored Bentley, his hand hesitantly coming to rest on her small shoulder. Not a single man present could have guessed that this rain-soaked little girl would pull their ruthless boss into a story that would shatter every rule he'd lived by for 20 years. The convoy of black vehicles cut through Boston's rain-slicked streets like shadows, headlights illuminating abandoned warehouses and graffiti-covered walls. Grace sat in the back seat of Sullivan's Bentley, wrapped in his cashmere coat that swallowed her tiny frame entirely, directing them with pointed fingers through neighborhoods no child should know. "There," she whispered, pointing at the crumbling remains of the Blackwell paper factory, a hollow skeleton of Sullivan's first legitimate business front from decades ago, behind the loading dock. The location wasn't random, and Sullivan's jaw tightened as decades-old memories surfaced unwelcome. Davis took point with 3 armed men, clearing the perimeter while Sullivan followed with unexpected urgency in his usually measured stride. The smell of rust and rain filled the abandoned space, and then something else, the metallic scent of fresh blood pooling on concrete. They found her propped against a wall, one hand pressed to her abdomen where crimson seeped between pale fingers. Harriet Wheeler had once been the brightest light in Francis Sullivan's dark world, his high school sweetheart before he chose power over love, before he became the man even police commissioners feared. "You came," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain drumming on the metal roof. Her once vibrant auburn hair hung limp around a face still beautiful, despite the years and pain etched into it. "I wasn't sure you would remember." Sullivan knelt beside her, pressing his handkerchief against the wound with surprising gentleness. "I remember everything, Harry," he said, using a nickname that hadn't crossed his lips in years. "Who did this to you?" Harriet's eyes fluttered, struggling to stay conscious. "The Donnelly brothers. They found out about Grace." Her fingers weakly gripped his wrist with surprising strength born of desperation. "They know she's yours, Francis." Sullivan's world stopped, his eyes darting to the small girl being carefully guarded by Davis a few yards away. The revelation wasn't spoken as a surprise, but as a confirmation of something he had suspected from the moment he saw her ice-blue eyes, identical to his own. "Get her to the car now," he barked, sliding his arms beneath Harriet's broken body with unexpected tenderness. "Tell Fletcher to be ready for a gunshot wound, possible internal bleeding." His men moved with practiced efficiency, but their eyes betrayed confusion at this sudden personal entanglement. In the car, Harriet drifted between consciousness and darkness, her head cradled in Sullivan's lap, while Grace watched with frightened eyes. "I never told you," Harriet murmured, blood staining her lips. "I was going to, but then the Castellini case happened and you became the monster everyone fears," Sullivan finished for her, his voice hollow as he pressed harder against her wound. "Why come back now after all these years?" The question carried the weight of 7 years of emptiness, of wondering where she had disappeared to after the trial that cemented his underworld status. Harriet's eyes found Grace, then returned to Sullivan's face with painful clarity. "Because they were going to use her to control you. The Donnellys know about the federal investigation." Her words came faster now, urgent. "They know you've been feeding information to Agent Phillips." Sullivan's expression hardened to granite. Only 3 people in the world knew about his confidential arrangement with the FBI, his attempt to extricate himself from the life that had consumed him. Now Harriet made 4, and the revelation that the Donnellys also knew meant only one thing: there was a traitor in his inner circle. Sullivan's private medical facility occupied the entire east wing of his secluded estate, equipped with technology that rivaled Boston's best hospitals. Dr. Fletcher, a gifted surgeon whose gambling debts had once placed him in Sullivan's debt, worked frantically to extract the bullet lodged dangerously close to Harriet's spine. Grace sat in the adjoining room, wrapped in fresh clothes that Sullivan's people had acquired with remarkable speed. She hadn't spoken since they arrived, her small hands meticulously arranging and rearranging a set of colored pencils a housekeeper had given her, while Sullivan's men secured the perimeter. 6 hours of surgery, Fletcher announced as he emerged, removing blood-stained gloves. "She lost a lot of blood, but she'll pull through. The bullet missed her vital organs by millimeters. Someone was watching over her." Sullivan dismissed the doctor with a nod, before turning to Davis. "I want everything on the Donnelly brothers. Their operations, their hideouts, their families." His voice was measured but carried an edge his men recognized as dangerous. "And I want to know how they learned about Phillips." When Sullivan finally approached Grace, the stone-cold crime boss seemed uncertain for the first time in decades. He lowered himself into a chair beside her, noticing how she'd drawn a house with 3 stick figures, a family that might have been in another life, another world. "Your mother is going to be okay," he said softly, the gentleness in his voice surprising even himself. Grace looked up at him with those ice-blue eyes, his eyes, and nodded as if she'd never doubted it. "Are you really my dad?" she asked with the direct simplicity only children possess. The question hung in the air between them, too heavy and too light all at once. Sullivan found himself unable to lie to this small person who carried his blood. "Yes," he answered, the single word changing everything. "I didn't know about you until tonight. Your mother, she kept you safe from my world." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It's not a good world for children." Grace considered this with surprising gravity for a 6-year-old. "Mom said you help people sometimes, that you protect them when no one else will." Her words reflected an image of him Sullivan barely recognized, a version of himself he'd abandoned long ago. Sullivan's security chief appeared in the doorway, interrupting the moment. "Sir, we have movement at the north gate. 3 vehicles, heavily armed." The brief connection between father and daughter fractured as Sullivan's demeanor instantly transformed back to the crime lord everyone feared. "Get them to the panic room," Sullivan ordered, standing to his full height as he drew his gun. "No one touches my family." The possessive declaration surprised even himself, but as bullets began to shatter the estate's windows, Sullivan knew he'd finally found something worth protecting more than his empire. The assault lasted 17 minutes, a lifetime in combat, but barely a blip in Boston's criminal history. 4 of Donnelly's men lay dead on Sullivan's manicured lawn, while the others retreated, leaving behind a clear message. This was just the beginning. Sullivan paced the security room like a caged predator, reviewing camera footage with clinical precision. How did they know about the medical wing? About the doctor? His voice was deadly quiet as he addressed his inner circle, the 5 men who had been with him since the beginning. Davis replayed the thermal imaging from the estate's perimeter. They approached from the blind spot in Sector 4. the one that isn't on any blueprint. His implication was clear. Someone had given the Donnellys insider information. The betrayal had to come from someone close, someone who knew not only about Sullivan's informant status, but also the estate's security vulnerabilities. Sullivan turned to his most trusted advisor, a man who had stood beside him for 20 years. Patrick, pull the phone records for everyone in this room, including mine. Oh, while his men hunted for the traitor, Sullivan returned to the panic room where Grace had fallen asleep, clutching her teddy bear. He watched her for a moment, this small life suddenly entrusted to his blood-stained hands, and felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Not weakness, but purpose. Dr. Fletcher approached with Harriet's medical chart. She's asking for you. She's still weak, but lucid. His expression betrayed professional concern. Whatever she needs to tell you, make it brief. Her body has been through significant trauma. Sullivan found Harriet pale but awake, tubes and monitors transforming her into something fragile and mechanical. When she saw him, a ghost of her former smile crossed her lips. You always did clean up well after a firefight. Why didn't you tell me about her? Sullivan asked, the question that had burned in him since her revelation. 7 years, Harry. She's been alive for 6 of them. The accusation in his voice was tempered by genuine hurt, an emotion his enemies would have paid millions to witness. Harriet's fingers weakly sought his. Because I saw what happened to the Castellini family when they tried to leave the life. The reference to the infamous massacre that had cemented Sullivan's reputation made him flinch. I couldn't risk our daughter becoming collateral damage in your war. The door burst open as Davis entered without knocking, a breach of protocol that indicated serious trouble. Boss, we found something. He handed Sullivan a phone with a text message displayed. It's from Patrick's burner phone to an unknown number. Medical wing, east side, light security during surgery. Sullivan's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Where is he now? His voice was soft, almost conversational, which anyone who knew him recognized as his most dangerous state. Conference room with the others. He doesn't know we found this yet. Davis shifted uncomfortably. There's more. The payments go back 18 months, right around when you started talking to Phillips. Sullivan entered the conference room with the calm of a man discussing the weather rather than confronting treason. Patrick, his right-hand man for 2 decades, looked up with a practiced smile that faltered when he saw Sullivan's eyes, cold and empty as a winter sky. You've been with me since Baltimore, Sullivan said quietly, placing Patrick's phone on the polished mahogany table. The message glowed accusingly on the screen. You pulled me out of that warehouse when the Colombians left me for dead. Patrick's hand moved imperceptibly toward his jacket, but Davis was faster. The gun pressed against the back of Patrick's head made him freeze. It wasn't personal, Francis. The Donnellys offered protection when they learned about Phillips. Sullivan circled the table slowly. You sold out my family. The words were simple, but carried the weight of judgment. Not just my organization, my blood. His hand rested on Patrick's shoulder with deceptive gentleness. The girl changes nothing, Patrick spat, desperation making him reckless. You're still going down when the feds finish building their case. The Donnellys know everything. Your offshore accounts, the judges you've bought, even the evidence you've given Phillips. Outside, thunder rolled across Boston's skyline as rain lashed against bulletproof windows. Sullivan leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. You're right about one thing. The girl changes everything, but not the way you think. Instead of the execution everyone expected, Sullivan straightened and buttoned his suit jacket. Lock him in the warehouse. No one touches him until I decide what happens next. The restraint shocked everyone in the room. The old Sullivan would have ended the betrayal with a bullet. Davis escorted Patrick out, while Sullivan turned to his remaining men. The Donnellys will come in force next time. They think they've found my weakness. A dangerous smile touched his lips. They don't understand what they've actually done. Sullivan returned to the medical wing where Dr. Fletcher was checking Harriet's vitals. She needs to be moved somewhere safer, the doctor advised. Somewhere not connected to you or your business. Somewhere the Donnellys wouldn't think to look. The solution came from an unexpected source as Grace looked up from her drawing. What about Grandma Tess's lake house? Mom said no one knows about it because it's not in her real name. Sullivan exchanged a surprised look with Harriet, who nodded weakly from her bed. Within hours, Sullivan had orchestrated a complex evacuation. The medical equipment was disguised in furniture delivery trucks, while Harriet and Grace were transported in an ambulance bearing the logo of a hospice company Sullivan owned through shell corporations. The lake house stood on 20 secluded acres in western Massachusetts, its existence hidden through layers of false identities and paper companies. As Sullivan supervised Harriet's installation in the master bedroom, Grace tugged at his sleeve. "Are the bad men going to find us here?" Sullivan knelt to her level, meeting those mirror image blue eyes. "No one is going to hurt you or your mother again. I promise." The vow wasn't just words. It was a fundamental shift in priorities for a man who had spent decades caring only about power and control. That night, as security teams patrolled the perimeter and Dr. Fletcher monitored Harriet's recovery, Sullivan stood on the dock overlooking the still lake. His phone buzzed with a message from Agent Phillips. "Meeting compromised. Donnellys have federal connections. Trust no one." 3 weeks passed at the lake house, a strange limbo where Sullivan lived between two worlds. By day, he helped Grace build elaborate pillow forts and watched Harriet regain her strength. By night, he managed his criminal empire remotely, planning the intricate dismantling of the Donnelly organization. "The feds are moving on the Donnellys' shipment tonight," Agent Phillips informed him during a secure call. "But we've identified their source in the Bureau. Assistant Director Moran has been on their payroll for years." The revelation explained how Sullivan's confidential arrangement had been compromised. Sullivan gazed through the window at Grace skipping stones across the lake with Davis, who had improbably become her favorite bodyguard. "I'm out after this, Phillips. I've given you enough to take down half of Boston's underground." His decision had crystallized gradually, then all at once. The conversation with Harriet that night was long overdue. She sat on the porch swing, finally strong enough to move without assistance, watching him approach with wary eyes that had once looked at him with unconditional love. "Grace asked me today if we're staying here forever." "What did you tell her?" Sullivan asked, noticing how the moonlight softened Harriet's face to the girl he'd known before power and ambition had consumed him, before he became the man whose name made even hardened criminals flinch. "I told her that depends on her father." Harriet's directness had always been what attracted him to her. "She's starting to love you, Francis." "That terrifies me because I know what happens to people who love Francis Sullivan." Sullivan's hands tightened on the porch railing. "I'm dismantling everything. The clubs, the shipping operations, the real estate holdings. All of it's being converted to legitimate businesses or sold off." The admission cost him nothing, which surprised him most of all. Harriet studied him with disbelief. "You've spent 20 years building an empire that makes you untouchable. Why walk away now?" The question wasn't accusatory, but genuinely puzzled, as if she couldn't reconcile this man with the one she'd fled from years ago. Sullivan's gaze drifted to Grace, visible through the window in her makeshift bedroom, carefully arranging her small collection of stuffed animals. "Because I never knew what I was protecting myself for until now. Money and power don't mean anything if you're alone. The Donnellys won't just let you walk away," Harriet warned, always practical even in the face of impossible hope. "And your own people might turn on you if they see weakness." Sullivan finally sat beside her on the swing, the closest they'd been since her surgery. "I've been feeding Phillips information for 18 months. Tomorrow night, the FBI raids the Donnelly compound and every business they control. Their federal contact will be arrested simultaneously." Morning brought an unexpected moment as Sullivan prepared for his return to Boston. Grace appeared in the doorway of his temporary room, clutching her teddy bear. "Are you my dad for real now? Or just until the bad men go away?" Sullivan crouched to her eye level, struck by the perception of a child who had learned to read adults too early. "I'm your dad forever, Grace. No matter what." The promise felt different than any deal he'd ever made, unbreakable in a way his most solemn criminal oaths had never been. The Boston skyline glittered against the night sky as Sullivan's car glided through the financial district toward his headquarters. The building, a legitimate investment firm that had laundered millions over the decades, would soon be transformed into something his daughter could someday inherit without shame. "The Donnelly raid is in progress," Davis reported from the passenger seat, monitoring police channels, FBI tactical teams at all 17 locations simultaneously. The operation represented months of Sullivan's careful intelligence gathering, packaged and delivered to Agent Phillips with clinical precision. What neither anticipated was the warning that had reached youngest Donnelly brother, Connor, hours before the raid. As Sullivan's car pulled into the private garage beneath his headquarters, a maintenance worker caught his eye, someone unfamiliar in a building where Sullivan knew every employee. "Get down!" Sullivan shouted, shoving Davis sideways as the first shots tore through the car's bulletproof glass, specialized ammunition designed to penetrate protective barriers. The explosion that followed rocked the entire structure, sending flames and concrete debris cascading across luxury vehicles. Sullivan dragged the wounded Davis behind a concrete pillar, assessing the ambush with the cold calculation that had kept him alive for decades. 4 shooters, north entrance, 2 more covering the elevator access. His hand pressed against the bleeding wound in Davis's shoulder. "They knew you were coming," Davis gasped, fumbling for his weapon with his good arm. Someone talked. Someone who knew about tonight. The betrayal cut deeper than the first. Sullivan had reduced his inner circle to only those he believed absolutely loyal after Patrick's treachery. Using the parked cars as cover, Sullivan methodically eliminated the attackers one by one, moving with the precision of a man who had spent decades surviving assassination attempts. The final assailant revealed the truth as Sullivan cornered him behind a support column. "Connor Donnelly sends his regards. Said to tell you we have your lake house address." Panic, an emotion Francis Sullivan had not felt in 20 years, surged through him as he executed the man with a single shot. "Get me Phillips," he barked into his phone while applying pressure to Davis's wound. The raid was compromised. They know about Harriet and Grace. The helicopter ride to western Massachusetts seemed endless. Sullivan watching the tracking signals from the security team he'd left at the lake house go dark one by one. When the pilot reported fires visible from the air, Sullivan felt something break inside him, a cold, hollow feeling beyond rage or fear. The scene that greeted him was apocalyptic, the lakeside property engulfed in flames, bodies of his security detail scattered across the once peaceful grounds. Sullivan moved through the inferno with single-minded focus, calling out for Grace and Harriet with a voice raw from smoke and desperation. He found Dr. Fletcher first, barely alive behind an overturned boat by the dock. "Panic room," the doctor wheezed through blood-flecked lips. "Got them in, before they breached. East wall panel." He pressed a keycard into Sullivan's hand before his eyes went vacant. The panic room, a reinforced chamber beneath the boathouse that Sullivan had installed without telling anyone but Davis, remained intact despite the destruction around it. When the heavy door swung open, Grace launched herself into Sullivan's arms, with a sob that shattered the last remnants of the crime lord's hardened heart. 6 months transformed Sullivan's life more radically than the previous 20 years combined. The joint FBI-ATF operation decimated the Donnelly organization, with Connor Donnelly captured attempting to flee the country on a private jet. Sullivan's immunity deal, negotiated through Phillips, required his complete cooperation and retirement from all criminal enterprises. Harriet and Grace lived under federal protection during the trials, their testimony proving crucial in convicting not only the Donnelly brothers, but also the corrupt assistant director who had compromised FBI operations. Sullivan watched them from the courtroom gallery each day, his expression unreadable as his former world collapsed around him. The modest house in Vermont represented Sullivan's new beginning, purchased through a legitimate trust with funds that had been thoroughly vetted by federal authorities. The 3-bedroom craftsman-style home with its wide porch and maple trees bore no resemblance to his former marble-floored mansion. "Are you really going to be a normal dad now?" Grace asked one evening, as Sullivan helped her with math homework at the kitchen table. The domesticity of the scene would have been unimaginable months earlier, the feared crime boss wearing reading glasses and explaining fractions. Harriet watched from the doorway, her expression still guarded but softening gradually as days passed without security threats or midnight phone calls. The woman who had once fled from Sullivan's world now cautiously allowed herself to consider a future within it, a future reimagined entirely. "Francis Sullivan died in that fire," he told Phillips during their final meeting, signing the last of the witness statements that would ensure the Donnelly organization never reformed. "I'm just Frank Wheeler now." The name change had been Harriet's idea, her family name becoming his new identity. The Sullivan Foundation launched with little fanfare but substantial funding, dedicated to helping families affected by gang violence in Boston's hardest-hit neighborhoods. Anonymous donations funded youth centers and scholarship programs, guided by a board of directors who never met their mysterious benefactor. Davis recovered slowly, choosing to join Sullivan in retirement, rather than seek new employment in Boston's criminal hierarchy. He moved to a neighboring town in Vermont, establishing a security consultation business that employed former soldiers transitioning to civilian life. On Grace's 7th birthday, Sullivan, now officially Frank Wheeler, watched as she blew out candles on a homemade cake in their backyard. Neighbors and schoolmates filled the space with laughter and normal childhood chaos that once would have made him deeply uncomfortable. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" Harriet asked quietly, standing beside him as they watched Grace unwrap presents. Her hand found his, fingers intertwining with tentative familiarity. The gesture spoke of forgiveness still in progress, of trust being rebuilt one day at a time. Sullivan thought about the night a desperate child had knocked on his door, how her small hand had unknowingly pulled him from darkness towards something he never believed possible. "No," he admitted honestly, "but I wouldn't trade it for anything I had before." That evening, as Sullivan tucked Grace into bed beneath glow-in-the-dark stars they had painstakingly arranged to match the real constellations, she asked the question he'd been waiting for. "Are you and Mom going to get married now that you're not a bad guy anymore?" Thank you all for staying with this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, please write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, as your support is essential for me to continue bringing these stories to life.